Welcome to the Kenneth Smith series, Millennia in Microcosm. We're at week 67. We're in chapter 4 out of this book, Millennia in Microcosm, that's being assembled from the column End Times, which appeared in 1998, 99, 2000 in the back of a magazine called the Comics Journal. In Millennia in Microcosm, we're engaging on the experiment of trying to learn how to detach ourselves from the modern worldview. The theory here is the theory of the fish being the one who can't discover water because the water is always present. So it's taken for granted because it's everywhere. It's impossible for the fish, unless we're talking a lungfish or a sea robin. Most fish are incapable of separating themselves from the water enough to look back and go, "Oh my goodness, water! I wonder if that's affecting the way I interact with the world." As a modern, we're the fishies that swim through the modern epoch and its zeitgeist. We take for granted all of its assumptions, and among its assumptions are that we see everything exactly the way it actually is. We believe that the past were full of superstitious primitives, but that moderns now are scientific and enlightened, and we're objective and we see things the way they actually are. But of course, because we inhabit the modern world, we're the least qualified to gauge what the effect of inhabiting modernity might be upon our ability to perceive the world. So just like the experiment of a sea robin stepping out of the water and looking back and going, "Oh my goodness, it's water," this book is running us through the experiment of stepping out of the modern worldview into two other zeitgeists for different epochs. The ancient zeitgeist, which is what we're going through now in chapter 4. And when we finish chapter 4, we'll move on to the medieval zeitgeist. And then in the final section of the book, armed with those two perspectives, we'll turn around and look back at the modern world and say, now, what does modernity seem to be when you can triangulate on it from two different perspectives, both of which are outside of the modern worldview? It's an exercise in basically creating some free will. And as long as we can't question the worldview of the epoch that we were raised in, we basically are symptoms of that epoch, rather than, what we only have the free will to act within the frame that it sets for us. So this is to see if we can't learn what the frame is and get some leverage to break out of it. So at Sharon's recommendation 2 weeks ago, we're moving ahead in section F, and this is the paragraph we left off on last time. We got partway through this last time we were working our way through section F. So I'm gonna walk us through this, and with the goal of this sort of ramping us up to move on to the new paragraphs that follow. But in general, section F, mythos and logos, this is the sixth of kind of the major themes of ancient civilization and the ancient perspective. And the idea here is that as moderns, we take for granted the idea that rationality is the only thinking worthy of the word, and that everything else we lump together in a sort of uncategory called irrationality. It doesn't even get anything positive of its own. It's just the absence of the good thing, which is rationality. And as such, we are inclined to ascribe all virtues of thinking to rationality, and all vices of our behavior then get lumped into irrationality. And you see this in the legal system, you see this in the political system, the economic system. Everything is structured with the idea that to be rational is to have all the good things of the mind, and to be irrational is to have all the bad things of the mind. We just take this for granted. It's built right into the language. You can hardly say the opposite. You can hardly say, "Oh my God, you can't be a whole wise person unless you're irrational." This makes no sense. This makes no sense in English. You can hardly say it. But to the Greeks, these were not one all good thing and one all bad thing. They were two faculties of the mind, each of which had positive and indeed essential characteristics. And if we want to be able to step out of the modern worldview, then we have to be able to look at the functioning of the human mind the way that the ancients do, which is that it's based on these two positive mental faculties, not one positive mental faculty and some kind of superstitious nonsense that we blame for all of our bad behavior. The terminology they developed for this was mythos and logos. And the idea is that logos is the rational part of the mind, the schematizing, systematizing, mathematizing, logic-oriented part of the mind, in which there are rules for what counts as a legitimate thought and what doesn't count. There are rules for how you derive new information from old information, and so forth. But mythos they saw as the more fundamental mental faculty. And mythos has to do with intuition. It has to do with the ability to be connected very closely to reality, whether it's the reality outside of us of what we're seeing and hearing and noticing, or whether it's the reality inside of us of what we're feeling or remembering from the past. And the Greeks believed that you can't even have logos unless you have mythos. That mythos is both a function in its own right and is also the cradle for the development of logos. This would be repeated later by Hegel when he talked about the subjective mind as being what we're born with. That's what you see in an infant, for example, in a very naive state. And that what he calls the objective mind has to develop out of that. Contra Kant, the objective mind is not fundamental. We aren't born with the ability to work logic problems. We get there gradually, step by step, through a painful process of negation, according to Hegel's expansion upon this Greek idea of mythos and logos. So again, to even talk about this, even to use these Greek terms, mythos and logos, we're confronted with language problems. To a modern, a myth is a falsehood, right? The myth of the self-made man. It's hard for us to use the Greek term in the positive sense that the Greeks meant it as. And what they meant it as is that the logos, the use of rational systematized thought, is great for finite things, but it's terrible at infinite things. When we're dealing with the extreme complexity of the cosmos, the extreme complexity of life, how do you figure out the relationship between the individual and the group? How do you judge what's right to do? These are incredibly intricate, complex issues that don't lend themselves to being simply diagrammed on a piece of paper, as a logical syllogism. They involve access to an enormous life experience of things that we have encountered, from which we try to murkily work out, maybe I shouldn't behave this way in this fashion. And we can construct an ideology on top of it to try to use as rules to follow. But we recognize that many ideologies, maybe all ideologies, go wrong off of our sense of right and wrong. Countless catastrophes in the modern world have been launched ideologically from people who are trying to follow a formula to decide what to do. The Nazis did it. Stalin did it. It's a very common thing to do, to say, I have put people into these categories. I have assigned discrete values to each one, and this now tells me what I should do, and what I should do is exterminate those people over there, or disregard the pain of that group over there. It's easy to do that when you're engaging in logos, but when you engage in mythos, it draws upon the larger set of experiences and feelings that you're not allowed to rule out the way that logos can rule things out. And so it has this ability to deal with complexity and nuance that's missing from logos. The Greeks perceived this, and you're going to see in the paragraphs that come, Kenneth Smith's going to talk about this. He's going to talk about Diogenes's withering critique of kind of late classical Greece, that they had gone so far into a logos culture that they lacked all character as people, that they were not willing to sacrifice themselves to do the right thing the way that they imagined that their ancestors had been able to. There was something lost when they began to do the modern thing and demonize mythos and sort of canonize logos. So this is what's being set up here. This is what we're talking about in this paragraph right here. So let's dive into it. He says, myth was indeed the ingenious precursor to philosophical culture in this way. So he's arguing that philosophy arises out of Greek mythology, out of and more generally out of mythos style thinking, not just the canonical collection of myths as we learned them from a book today, but the way that Greek agriculture and hunting and fishing, the very old lifestyle that they brought with them, kept them deeply connected to the land and the experience of life in a way that was perceived as authoritative. Not just some kind of primitive foundation to build atop, but was itself authoritative. As you see in their pantheon, many of their deities reflect aspects of the land and the wilderness and give them an authority that's somewhat confusing to moderns. Why is Artemis the equal of Apollo? I mean, to us, it makes sense that Apollo, the god of enlightenment and reason, should be elevated on high. But we don't understand why the Greeks would put his sister Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and the wilderness, on an equal footing. We think to ourselves, when we read the Greek myths, we want to go back and rewrite them mentally and say, well, he's really the important one and she's this obscure goddess. But that's not the way the Greeks saw it. They called them twins. So they were equally authoritative. They were both armed with their great bows that they fired, into the world of human beings to provoke action. You see this as well in the pairing up of Apollo and Dionysus. Dionysus, the god of, the vine, of being drunk, of losing control over one's rational mind. I mean, he almost to us seems to epitomize the irrational. So how could he possibly be an equal to Apollo? Because in the modern sense, to be drunk off your ass and have no idea, to lose yourself in the bottle and no longer be able to command yourself the way that you do rationally when you're sober, to us, that's not some kind of equal to rational thinking and enlightenment. To us, that's the opposite of it. We demonize one and we canonize the other. But the Greeks didn't see it that way. They raised them both up. And what they're talking about is to the Greeks to raise up the alcoholic stupor, right, to the level of rational enlightenment, is arguing that rational enlightenment can only give you access to so much of reality, to so much of truth. And that part of the time, you also need to break free of your ideologies and your logical schemas in order to reconnect with the direct experience of your feelings, your memories, the direct experience of what's immediately happening to you. And yeah, you're going to look like a fool. You're going to look like an idiot. You're going to be more childlike. Your emotions are going to get away from you. Raving maenads running upon the moors, tearing to pieces the people that they catch. Crazy things can happen when you're under the influence of Dionysus. But also to the Greeks, Dionysus is the creator of the art form of the theater and tragedy, in which we see the deeper issues of human existence, fatedness, for example, being illustrated in such a way, not that we can sit back in a distance and rationally contemplate them, but so that we can actually live through the lives of characters like Agamemnon or Oedipus and feel what they felt, experience what they experienced, and therefore hammer home the hard lessons about what happens when a mortal tries to interact with the infinite. They saw that as equally important as being able to run a logical syllogism or say something sober and impressive, in front of the agora. So I guess the third example I'll give on this sentence, and I'll call you in just a sec, Stephen. The third example I'll give of this is Heraclitus, who is credited sometimes as an inventor of science, or at least a promoter of science, when he talks about how he gives little credence to people's opinions, to what things that you hear from other people. And he gives more credence to the things you directly experience in life, because he says, people, even popular opinions, even the opinions of people who are highly revered, don't give you any direct access to the truth. If you want access to the truth, you have to go connect to the real world. You have to actually test things. You have to touch things. You have to look at things. That we have to use the truth of the world around us as a check on the truths that we try to cling to through our ideologies and belief systems. So he's talking about the same kind of leveraging of the truth of the world against what's in our heads. That's the foundation of all science. And he's revered by later philosophers as being an incredible influence. He lays down basic ideas of epistemology, axiology, and so forth. But so where did he come up with all of this? Well, the assessments of people going back and studying the history is that it's because his family was the family that ran the Eleusinian mysteries in Ephesus, where he lived. That is to say, they headed up the religion of this deep experiential, emotive mystery cult, the Eleusinian mysteries. And if you go back and read the fragments of the Eleusinian mysteries that have survived to this day, we don't have a full accounting of it, but if you find passages of the fragments, you'll recognize immediately the same kinds of paradoxes and the use of kind of dense poetic language to try to illustrate, general universal themes. The same style of writing that Heraclitus exhibits in his fragments are already present in Eleusinian mysteries, which is the mythos. So when he says that myth was the ingenious precursor to philosophical culture, he's not just waving his arms and trying to make some kind of an argument for purposes of landing a PhD or getting something published. He's pointing to something that not only happened in Greece, but that the Greeks themselves understood about their own culture. They saw philosophy as rising out of their own mythology, and they saw the roots that nourished their philosophy as needing to remain in that soil for their philosophy to survive. And this is a very different concept of philosophy than what you find today in a university. And in this difference, we see reflected this distinction that he's trying to help us draw between the modern interpretation of something like philosophy, which is highly Apollonian, very, very noetic, very, very logos oriented, and the ancient conception of philosophy, which is very experiential, very gnosic, very rooted in experience, and which is why these early philosophers before Socrates are so often using tangible material metaphors for everything. Thales, everything is water, right? Heraclitus often it said Heraclitus says that everything is fire, but he says a lot more than that. He also talks about the river, which is a tangible thing. He talks about the bow and arrow, which is tangible. He talks about the lyre, which is tangible. He's constantly trying to bring it back to tangible things because that's how the Greeks generalized. They didn't want to get too far away from reality, at least early on. All right, Stephen, and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen. What's on your mind?
Oh, yes, I was just wondering. So we have a claim here that the Greeks at the very early points of their culture had a lot of personnel who had a very different view of the world from the modern, and saw the organs of society in an intensely different way. A bit like West Virginians, I suppose. Joke. Have there been, I assume there have been other scholars going back through the last 2 or 3 centuries who have been making this claim. It's not a claim that I come across in my school history textbook. It's not going to have this in it. So who were the previous sort of scholars that were saying, no, you look at what's going on here. There's a very different cosmic conception to what we know today. As you're saying, a conception much more involved in mythos and etc. Who were the other scholars which might have claimed something similar? Thank you.
So, yeah, I mean, obviously people have been fascinated with the Greeks and trying to understand what they were talking about, going back at least to the Renaissance in European culture, at least. During the medieval period, as we're going to see when we get into the later the chapters in the middle of the book, there was enthusiastic censoring of which Greek philosophers you were allowed to look at. If you were going to talk about Plato, then Augustine might like what you're doing. If you're going to talk about Aristotle, then Aquinas might like what you're doing. But you start veering too much off into the Greeks who didn't seem to back up Christianity as clearly, and those are the books that tended to not be copied and covered over. So Heraclitus, although he didn't disappear during the Middle Ages, he kind of turned into this. Diogenes and Heraclitus both turned into these abstract characters, the laughing philosopher and the weeping philosopher, rather than people tangibly coming to grips with what they were saying. It's starting in and after the Renaissance that people start rediscovering them. And especially in the 19th century, the Germans really began digging into the fragments and collecting, collating, cataloging the fragments of Heraclitus and trying to see, when you extract them out of the sources that record them and put them all together, what does it look like he's talking about? And there's basically been a resurgence of awareness in Heraclitus, starting with the 19th century Germans. You'll see Hegel talking about him. You'll see Nietzsche talking about him, and so forth, before it really expands more widely than that. The same is true for most of the pre-Socratics. I mean, the pre-Socratics sort of became this, I want to say, rediscovered topic, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. They didn't leave complete works behind, not because they didn't write them, but because the medieval theologians were not interested in them, so they didn't preserve them as much. So it's really been treated as this second Renaissance, a rediscovery of the broader range of Greek thinking, the more alien range of Greek thinking, if that makes any sense. So what happened earlier on was the rediscovery of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and others who had been preserved, who people started talking about more often in the 15, 16, 1700s. But you don't get these pre-Socratics as clearly understood until really the 19th and 20th century. And if you were to survey and go collect, for example, all the books about Heraclitus and see what people are saying in them, you'll see they're still arguing about exactly what does it mean. I mean, there's a level of still coming to grips with the material that you don't see as often with the material about Plato or Aristotle, which people have been more openly debating for a much longer period of time. So I would say that the process of discovery for these pre-Socratics we're still in the middle of it. It's not finished by any means. It was only about 12, 15 years ago, maybe, that the very first comprehensive collection of every scrap of information from the Greek corpus about Heraclitus was published in a giant multi-volume work. I mean, I've got it downstairs, and it was this guy's life work to finally go through and not just copy what other people said was in the corpus, but to go through the whole thing himself and publish every single fragment, every copy, every variant of it, so that it's all in one place for the first time. You would think that had been done the 19th century or 18th century or sometime in the past, but it's literally the 21st century, and it's for the very first time you can actually find every last scrap that we have available to us in print. So
yes, I might add that going with the German philosophers, there's a whole heap of German philosophers who don't really make the media in general. They would be known to a few scholars, but you've got guys that were contemporary with Goethe that we don't tend to study very much. We have a lot of guys in the latter part of the 19th century, like Nietzsche's teachers, that ordinarily we're not going to see their names crop up all that often. But people talk about them and say, these were some of the great minds,
right,
that we haven't heard of.
That's right. That's right. I'm always struck by the way that, we look back at Beethoven as being the great giant of classical music. Nobody's like him in his time. He just stands apart from everyone else. And yet that's not what he thought. He saw himself as the underdog fighting against the popularity of a German composer named Spohr. And he thought that, Spohr mostly had the advantage over him, and more people like Spohr than liked Beethoven. He spent his whole career kind of with these feelings of insecurity and competition. And you would never know that from the way people talk about Beethoven today, that there had been anybody else comparable during his life. We may talk about Bach and Mozart before him and Brahms and others after him, but we sort of treat Beethoven like, at least in his time, there was just this one guy, and maybe, some dwarves. The idea that there were other people who were completely on a par with him is almost entirely forgotten today. And it's just like what you're saying. Who were the influences on Nietzsche? Who was he reading? Who were these pre-Socratics was one of this area up until recently. In just a few centuries ago, people only had the vaguest idea who was present. Prior to Plato, they could list some names. They might be able to say one thing about. They might be able to say Thales thought everything was water, and then they'd be done. That's all they knew. So the idea of actually putting together these people's kind of, if not complete, at least a not as ridiculously caricatured interpretation of their philosophy. This is a modern phenomenon, very, very recent. So good question, Stephen. Thank you. Phil, go ahead. What's on your mind?
Yeah, as you talked about mythos and logos, I have a number of several complex thoughts. One is that it seems to me, on one level, logos seems to like reduce things down to kind of simplistic state in which you could deal with, I guess, what the fundamental particles in a way. And it is based on that a sense of purification and reduction that gives you the essence of the fundamentals, and then you can build from that. And that seems like a kind of a mechanistic model of sorts. And that would make a lot of sense, because like somebody like Newton certainly was mechanistic, although a great genius. The whole thing about, the deity being the supreme designer, that's what deism is about. And it seems to me mythos deals with complexity, the way that we find a world in an ordinary way, not in breaking it down to the fundamental particles. But we find water, we find earth, we find steel, and we find all these things, and they are already complex to begin with. And the basis of that, it turns out, and my belief is that it has something to do with a commitment to life rather than mechanics. And that within that life, I guess there is a kind of force, I guess we would call it a psyche, that in a sense drives it. And it creates these sort of complexities, as I see it, in terms of like a kind of cycle of things, of movements. One cycle you could say is a kind of ecological cycle that's much more complex, but within the ecology, there's a human body, which is a cycle. You could call that an ecology, and all sorts of things. It's seasons, that's the cycle. And it just seems to me like, I don't think they truly deny a linearity of development, but this linearity is also spinning around in cycles. That's because the biological model of life, it's always a process of living that tries to continue, but there's a use update. And so that's a different kind of struggle. And it deals with complexity because it finds so many things. To me, it almost seems, if you want to think about it in a kind of like atomic sense, it seems to be more at a molecular level, like water, H2O. They didn't call it H2O. That's not what water is about. It's just water. We break it down. But if you break it down to its fundamental parts, or even worse, you break the fundamental parts into something subatomic and fundamental, you're never gonna experience water that you need to live in. I mean, you can experience all sorts of other things, I'm sure, but you're not going to experience water. And so I think that you could call that just a primitive sense, that they haven't arrived at the complexity within simplicity, or you could call that, no, that is the perfect moment about what life is about, rather than, let's say, I guess, absolute knowledge. And so in some sense, it almost seems like mythos always want to maintain the surplus of ambiguity. And what that does is that, because it cycles within that level, you could say that's a lower level or higher level, but it's a different level. That's the essence of living things, including ourselves, that moves through this sort of like, and it's very interesting. I think part of the reason why modernity moved on is because the mechanistic world got more and more complex and developed more and more. And so the search for the purity of the foundational structure began to displace this sort of more complex movement of surpluses, let's put it that way. And as a result, we now all think of like physics is the paradigm of science. I mean, it is the essence of science. All the others are kind of sub-disciplines. Now we found out, actually, I think recently, there are many more exciting things coming out of biology than physics, right? And physics almost have run into a kind of a dead end, and which is maybe there's a comeback to this sort of the life force or the life, how do all these things, live when they have to deal with such a complex world of molecules and atoms and all these other things they don't even sense. So I think, I mean, I kind of think that you have to exist in both worlds. You have to know that life is about living, and not just understanding, but also living. And the thing about dealing in the molecular level is that things are ready at hand to use. You have to make some transformations, but it's kind of like, I need a hammer. Oh, there it is. I have one on the workbench. Like, oh no, you have to invent a hammer. It's like, it's just, and inventing the hammer, that might take 1,000 years. So you have a long time to wait for that to happen. And it's like, by the time your great grandchildren will be able to use that thing, maybe you write down the notes, like, this is how we use a hammer once we invent it. So they say, great granddaddy was pretty smart, but he never got to use one. So I mean, I think we have to find some middle ground in which we could exist, besides pure understanding. So
Yeah,
that's my spiel about that.
thanks, Phil. Yes, so I'm with you on that. And so let's go back to the text, and it's gonna parallel some of what Phil was just saying. The next sentence, somewhat longer, builds on this. Long before rationalist philosophers such as Socrates perceived how nearly impossible it was for humans to achieve knowledge of themselves, myths had already devised oblique ways of insinuating a powerful sense of self-insight and of disarming conscious ego's resistance against wisdom and criticism of its own illusions and delusions. Well, there's a lot going on here, but part of what he's talking about is this idea that epistemology, one of the core disciplines of philosophy, is dealing with how much of what we think we know do we actually know, and how much confidence should we have in our opinions and ideas, and if we find them lacking, what is the path to trying to acquire firmer knowledge? And this is, many people, when they think of philosophy, they think of epistemology first as the kind of most central issue in philosophy. And he's arguing here, and he's not the first to do so. Nietzsche certainly did before, and Hegel before him, that you can see the core issues of epistemology directly in the Greek myths. They are brought up directly as problems. As we've talked about in previous sessions, the tragedy of Oedipus is, among other things, an exploration of the limits of human epistemology. That Oedipus could be the smartest person of his lifetime, smartest person of his, not only of his polis, but even of his era, the cleverest, the most committed to the truth, and still he could be so wrong about his circumstances that all his best efforts led to the worst possible catastrophe a Greek could imagine for a human life. Moderns read the myth of Oedipus, and we say, oh, it's some stupid kinky story about some guy who married his mom and killed his dad. But that's not the point at all. The point is, how easy is it for a mortal with our finitude of understanding to go wrong when trying to make choices within an infinite cosmos? The context, the necessary context for us to make decisions is so often missing in our minds. We don't understand the things we need to understand, the things that are the most important to understand about a situation. And missing those, it really doesn't matter how smart or clever we are, or any of the other gifts we have, they all turn into vices. This is kind of the science. If we call mythos an alternative form of thinking, this would be sort of the mythic science of tragedy, is how little it takes for virtues to become vices. For not through changing into a vice, but through the very action of the virtue itself, the worst consequences, follow. And this kind of approach to the myths was being encouraged consciously by the Greek governments of that era. When they did the Olympian Games, there was a lot more going on than people, doing shot puts and throwing javelins. They were also competing for their ability to transmute their common shared religion into these plays that would kind of distill the human experience and the challenges of being a human being, out of the structure of the myths as they already existed. What Oedipus, won the Olympics his year for Oedipus Tyrannus, as being kind of the most potent distillation from the Greek myths that year, contributed to, at the Olympian Games. So this idea that the purpose of mythos culture and the mythic religion was to kind of go back over and over and over to their shared roots and find the deeper meanings that were in there, and then draw them out into an experiential form that anybody could experience in the course of watching a play. This was very core to what the Olympian project was. This is also tied up with a subject that we don't often learn as much about when we study the Greek myths, is the mystery religions. We hear a lot about the major Olympian religion and who are the 12 major gods, and what are the main myths about the main heroes, blah blah blah. But we don't hear nearly as much about the Eleusinian mysteries or the Samothracian mysteries, the Orphic mysteries. What were these mystery religions? What were they about? What was their purpose? Why would prominent Greeks say, for example, that the Eleusinian mysteries were what separated the Greeks from being barbarians? Why would they say that this mystery religion was so important that it made life worth living and helped us to be decent human beings? And core to it is the idea of a mystery religion. And the idea of a mystery religion is the core of epistemology, right? The core of a mystery religion is the things you think are inadequate. There's more to life than what you think you understand. You may think that you understand it all, but you only get the surface of things. And the only way to break through that and break through your certainty is to initiate you into the mystery religion and walk you through a potent experience that's so suggestive of a deeper wisdom, with so much emotional potency, that you'll come out the other side of this, of having gone through the initiation, a changed person for the rest of your life. The core to this is this idea that a mature human being, an intelligent human being, an experienced, educated human being can be so wrong about what's real that there are all these experiences waiting for them to be initiated into that will rock their world. This is like the core of what the horror is in H.P. Lovecraft's horror stories, right? They're always some hugely overconfident, highly educated European person who comes into contact with the true nature of the cosmos, and it drives them insane because it's so different. Because they can't deal with how wrong they are. They're not willing to accept the idea that a mortal might not have perfect understanding, of an infinite cosmos. There's a brittleness, right, that the protagonists in H.P. Lovecraft's horror stories, are exemplify specifically so that, in effect, he can put them through a mystery religion initiation in his fictional forms, and they come out the other side transformed. Usually not for the better. In the case of the Samothracian mysteries, of the Eleusinian mysteries, the idea is you come out the other side so much better because the rigidity of your overly noetic understanding of the world, your egotistical overconfidence about what's true and what's false, gets broken down when you experience reality directly, without the benefit of kind of sitting in your armchair and analyzing it from a distance. That the process of experiencing the world is able to disrupt any number of ideologies and theories and so forth. And so this is built into the structure of their religion. They think for you to not be a child anymore, for you to understand the world in an adult fashion, it's expected that you're supposed to overthrow your core beliefs by going through potent experiences. And these experiences, there's a lot of interesting stuff written about that. Frequently they use hallucinogens of some kind. Sometimes it was just alcohol. Sometimes it was psilocybin. Sometimes it was other things. But they use powerful visuals and auditory experiences, tastes, smells, foods, drinks. There's often, taking them into the darkness and then they emerge into the light. There's a lot of direct sensory, manipulation of the person's experience in order to try to crack open whatever ideologies have them bound up so that they can take a look at the world fresh. And we know that the Eleusinian mysteries in particular have something to do with these cycles of life that Phil was alluding to. There's this sense in which we think of our life, naively at first as it just is. And, we all talk about how an adolescent feels. They behave as though they're immortal and can't die and take all these crazy risks. And then we sort of expect them to grow out of that and come to understand life as an arc from birth to death with a flourishing in the middle. And then that's supposed to be it. But the Eleusinian mysteries, we know they're based on Demeter, the goddess of agriculture and the cycles of planting. And we know that the hallucinogen they used, we know a little bit about it. We know it involved grains in an alcoholic suspension that you had to stir regularly while you drank it. And we know that because Heraclitus actually refers to that as one of his metaphors for things that only survive as long as they're in flux, like a human life. He says, you stop stirring and it simply stops. It ceases to be the drink, the sacred drink. But most of the details of the Eleusinian mysteries we're never going to know. They were sworn to secrecy, and generally they didn't share them. So what we take out of it is this sense that whatever the details might have been, the general framework is the core of everything that we call epistemology today in philosophy. The general framework is this idea of not letting yourself be suckered into ideologies, that you need to, on the one hand, you have to educate yourself and expose yourself to a lot of experiences and so forth. You're supposed to build up an understanding of life. This is the logos side. But on the other hand, you also want to retain the ability of a child to notice what's actually happening. You want to resist the temptation to let your ideology edit what you're allowed to notice. You don't want your mind to become a bed of Procrustes that distorts everything to fit the bed perfectly, the way that people who are overly ideologically bound do. And this idea that you have to balance these two things and that it's very hard to do is at the very core of Greek mythology, and thus when he says that, Socrates's critique of epistemology, or later Diogenes's critique of whether people actually understand the world, all of them derive directly from the mythology itself, not in some arm wavy way, but in a way that any Greek would have said, well, of course it does. And this is why one of the only death sentences Athens had was, in fact, meted out to Socrates for the one thing you're not allowed to mess with is the core of the religion, which they thought all their good things came from. They said, you can't let yourself become so overly rational and logical that you uproot yourself from the culture and from the experience of life that culture allows for us. So everything in this sentence about looking at yourself, self-insight, this is the phrase that Stephen, one of them that Stephen was asking about at the beginning, right there in the sentence, this, can you turn and see yourself? Can you turn and look at your own mind? Gnothe auton, right on the entryway to the oracle at Delphi. This idea that of all the things that you can use your mind to criticize, the thing that you most need to apply its capabilities of criticism against is yourself and your own ideas and beliefs. This goes right to the core foundations of the mythos itself. And from this, they derive their philosophy. Socrates regularly goes back to Gnothe auton. Heraclitus regularly goes back to Gnothe auton. Plato, he doesn't just quote Socrates doing it. Plato himself goes directly back to Gnothe auton. They all see it as central to what philosophy could possibly be and what wisdom could possibly be. Phil, go ahead. What's on your mind?
Yes, as you were talking through that, the one thing that's very problematic is that we have trouble getting out of the structure of understanding that we're in. I mean, that really is the divided line in a deep way. The problem is that you depend on that as the foundation of your understanding. So it's almost like a fish suddenly decided, well, I'm just going to deny water. I mean, that's not going to work. So you need that foundation, but you also need to know when to let it go. That's why I mean living in the borderlines, And I mean that as a metaphor. I don't mean like, well, I happen to live close to Mexico, but I don't mean like just stand there, like walk back and forth. I do mean that there's an exchange of ideas and understanding. I'm really committed, at least to the modern formalism in art. Okay, so I'll restrict that to that. And one of the exercises I did, that the first one, the most important one, is the one on which I had them draw a bunch of horizontal and vertical straight lines. And they spent, literally a long time in doing that. And the students think that I'm teaching them a technique, the perfection, make that line really, really straight and really, really in one stroke and even in density, if not erase it and do it again. Do it again and do it again and do it again. So this is really like a technical exercise, how to render things nicely. This is his method. And what I did was, in a sense, I was teaching them the commitment to the picture plane. That is the most fundamental form in modernism. Just like teaching them, there actually is a basketball court. I remember when I was actually coaching wrestling, because my wrestling teacher had a sabbatical, and the teacher there was a gymnast, and so fortunately, I guess he understood that I was pretty talented. So I actually, in a sense, technically coach the team. And I used to remember, I said, one of the things you got to understand is the dimension of the mat. That the center of the ring is different from the edge, right? If you're on the edge, you'll probably want to be close to the outside. So the guy comes in a tackle, and he's got you. You just fall out of bounds and out of bounds. Start over again in the center, right? If you're in the other direction, then you're in big trouble. So always be aware that, where you're legally, legally get out of bounds and stop the clock, stop everything, go back to the center and start over again. And I think that was an important thing to teach. But I remember what I did was, and that thing is, it wasn't about whatever. I wanted them to say, I literally said this. I said, if you respect this, and that's all you learn from me, I'll call it even. That means get a C. All right. Now, of course, I meant something more than, let's say, oh, there's a piece of paper. We know that. But is there a picture plane? Do you understand the form? Okay. And by doing it over and over again, I actually physically had to move through the picture plane so that they are inhabiting the picture plane through doing and action. Even though they didn't know what they were doing, they physically went around. And when I explained it, I said, that is really related to Muhammad Ali when he was fighting in Zaire. And he usually, the defending champ would come out first, and then the challenger would come in a little later, But he went in a whole half an hour before the thing began. And he literally paced back and forth the ring. He claimed this space, right? He claimed this space. This is my space. We know that when a smaller fish is defending his home, he's much, much more aggressive. If he was swimming into the big fish's territory, heaven help him. But if he's defending his own turf, then in a sense, it's like, no, this is my turf. I belong here. And so that's important. Okay. So therefore, I don't mean that you understand there's a piece of paper, because the piece of paper used to just be a background for you to draw a picture. But this is part of the picture that you are drawing. You're interacting with it as a relationship of forces. But later on, when I was teaching in Youngstown, there was a visiting artist who had a number of, I guess, drawings. And she says, I have a problem with the corner of this picture, And I said, have you ever thought of, let's say, just taping another piece of paper next to it and just go beyond the picture plane, right?
Yes.
Even though I am so adamant about the picture plane, there are times where you got to go across, just kind of like a Vietnam War, you have to go into Laos, which is what the Vietnamese did by, the trail. So in some sense, you have to know when you have to break the rules to go beyond the grounding that you're making, because that grounding is synthetic. It's a structure that we put in to help our mind understand what the grounding is. And when it's time to change the equation, like Einstein, did the thing, he had to have help from mathematician to develop a new mathematics that talk about relativity, right? It's like, no, the Newton picture plane, it doesn't quite work. It was incomplete. We have to change it. Mm-hmm. So I think that is the important thing, is know, as much as you're committed to whatever it is, there are instances when you have to break the picture plane. And if you do not know that, then in a sense, you are sealed. I remember, like I said, several weeks ago, I was in a thing, in a local meeting. It was kind of a philosophy group. The question was, why is life so hard? And I agree with them, it's difficult for the working class and to the middle class and so forth. We can't seem to have enough money. And so I supported that. Everybody's complaining about this and the school structure. All this is, it's like, I just can't handle it. And finally, I got to the point, I said, while I agree with you, you guys are submitting yourself to a slave culture. Because all you have, all you're fighting for is you want a slightly bigger piece of pie, but you're in the same damn structure, right? I told him, when I was young, I knew that you have to have some money, but I didn't stop that from preventing me to try to be a human being. Right? You have to forget about that. Otherwise you're trapped in the structure itself.
Right.
And that becomes oppressive, but it is hard to, as I get older, I notice, in some sense, I'm getting slightly more conservative. It's hard. You lose the energy. You can't push. You can't push as hard when you're in your 70s as you were when you're in your 30s, and so therefore you're drifting to maybe not today kind of thing. So I think that's important to keep that young spirit. And I'm always been surprised when I teach. Seldom do I find, I was a little younger then, I wasn't quite as old as I am now. I seldom find somebody who believe in traversing beyond to myself. And I'm like 30, 40 years older than they are. It's like, God, they had given up the fight. They have given up the fight when they should just be beginning the fight. So I'll just leave it at that, No one to break the rules and no one to follow the rules, No one to fold. Isn't that one of those?
Kenny Rogers.
Kenny Rogers. One to hold them and one to fold them. That's it.
Right.
That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to riff on that a little bit when I get to the next sentence in the Kenneth Smith line, where he's talking about obsession. Where we'll talk about Daedalus and the frame to some extent there. So, but first, Joseph, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was actually, looking at something else that Kenneth had written recently, and it's related to this, and it stated that reason in harmony with nature, a life respectful of normative natural law, was already grasped as a key to wisdom by Heraclitus and Aristotle and others. Nature alone is not sufficient to impel us to our defining excellence as humans, but all achieved human excellence must be in congruity with the natural order. What does he mean by the natural order? How is he distinguishing between the natural order and nature? Because it's the only thing as I can kind of think of is that the true natural order is unknowable. So therefore, that in that particular, so that we need to, rely on things that are not necessarily rational.
Would you like me to answer that?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Sure. So, this is one of those places where we get into trouble in English because the word nature has a telescoping definition. But if we use Greek as our frame of reference here, we see that, there's a natural world that is around us, and as Heraclitus says, also within us. But the way that it behaves is not arbitrary or random, there's a lawfulness to it, and that lawfulness is determined by its fundamental character. And this goes back to, one of the earlier themes of the ancient world, the idea that everything that we think of as a thing, whether rightly or wrongly, has a character, and that character determines the impulses of teleology. What does that thing want? How does it behave? What kinds of patterns does it tend to unfold when it acts? And so nature has this dual meaning where on the one hand, it's the natural world, but on the other hand, the nature of nature is the character of nature that determines why nature unfolds into all the things we see around us. So when he talks about the natural order, he's referring to the character of nature, or what we might say the nature of nature, the underlying archai, the core principles that make it unfold as it is. And as we talked about early in the earlier sections in chapter 4, this theme is, to the Greeks, is it's the core metaphor that they recapitulate everywhere, including on themselves and within themselves. The way we look around and see a bunch of things waiting to be utilized, the Greeks looked around and saw a bunch of organisms that are all unfolding according to their inner character. Everything around us is some kind of organism, and including groups of things together make up, ecosystem. The concept of an ecosystem, which took so long to develop for moderns because it didn't fit tidily into our preferred mathematics or physics little boxes of you are this and you're not that, was natural to the Greeks. So everything was an ecosystem. That was their normal way of looking at the world. And every one of these organisms, whether we're talking about what you think of as a single organism like yourself, or what you might think of as a composite organism like a polis or a culture, they saw as an organism that had its own character, and that character was its inner nature that determined what that organism would do and how it would respond to the world. So these are the themes that he's talking about when he invokes the natural order. And of course, the thing that's important to pin down here is he's always thinking of Heraclitus, and for Heraclitus, the key word for understanding the natural order was logos, but with a capital L, not a lowercase l. Lowercase l logos is just the Noetic way of thinking and organizing the world, like moderns do. But the capital L logos is the opposite. It's the intelligence of the natural order, the intelligence of the natural world. The logos is the intelligence of the character of nature. And from that, Heraclitus is basically asserting that, and in fact, he says it flat out, that for a human being to be wise, we would have to align our intelligence with the intelligence of nature. We would have to learn about the logos, and we'd have to learn about our own character to figure out what makes us tick and why we think the way we do. And when we find discrepancies, we should bring them into alignment by paying more attention to what he calls the shared intelligence, the intelligence that's common to us all, which is this order of nature that Kenneth Smith's referring to here. So it ties into a lot of stuff. I mean, it's a great question.
Could I say something about that?
Yeah.
First Joseph and then Phil. Go ahead.
No,
Joseph.
I mean, I was just thinking about this in terms of living in accordance with nature, how he's distinguishing that. So that was helpful for me. I mean, that's the only reason I brought it up. Because obviously a lot of Stoicism actually deals with the idea of living in accordance with nature. And there is some idea even of how to define the logos within that, right? Whether the logos is a set of facts now, or is the logos something that is, a living, kind of a organism almost.
Yeah, definitely the latter. Definitely the latter. Great question, Joseph. Thanks.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, let me respond to that. I mean, I find it a bit more of a problem than Rick explained. Is because there really is a gap between the finite intellect of ours and the infinity. I'll say the Tao, because the Tao is not the eternal Tao. The Tao you speak of is not the eternal Tao. It's beyond that. Because the Tao is not just the Tao, it's the Tao De Ching. How do you bring the Tao down to the path of human understanding? I think that's always difficult. And there's almost a kind of unfairness about it in existence in this sense, because there's always that little gap, well, actually a big gap, that you can't comprehend. However, you are responsible for your life, despite the fact that you are incapable of controlling all the factors. And, that certainly was the case with Oedipus. He finally realized, there was a lot that's going on in fate, but I'm in charge. I'm responsible for that.
Yes.
And part of the problem with, modern governments is that nobody wants to be responsible. They want to do the damn thing, but they don't want to be responsible about the possibilities that might come out of it. Putin, it's a good example. The Chinese understood this in a funny way because, it's always the De. You can't quite handle the De. You don't really have at least an absolute control of it. The mandate of heaven is a very, very important concept because, right now I'm just sort of thinking, all the floods and droughts and everything that's happening in China, some of it is an act of nature. I mean, the emperor Xi Jinping has nothing to do with that part. He has a lot to do with other parts. But the Chinese civilization have a right to switch the government when the heaven is not pleased. And you want to be the emperor, you are responsible, right? Same thing. If you're the father, the patriarch of your clan, of your family, and your son does something bad, you will also be punished along with your son. Because it was your job to inform him, to put a damper on it so he doesn't go off the apple cart. So there's a responsibility that not only extends between you and the act you do, because action, and we're commanded to act. Just I don't know, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to sit here. Life doesn't permit you to do that.
Yeah.
You just try doing that and you see how long you're going to last. So you have to act despite the fact that you're actually not quite capable of action. And so in some sense, you're not responsible, but you are responsible nonetheless. That is the unfair position you're in.
Yeah.
And the higher up you are, the more responsibility you have. That's why I would never want to be emperor.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be a sacrifice to be the emperor, to take on the slings and arrows of something that you didn't do, but you are responsible anyway for it. So
yes.
I think it is unfair, but that is the human condition,
Yes.
Okay, that's it.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I'm with DLJ. Accountability rather than responsibility is part of where this goes into, or let's say responsibility rather than guilt or shame or fault. It's like this is the problem of the human condition, that as finite beings who act in an infinite world, it is inevitable that we don't have all the information we need. And along with the intended consequences of the actions we take, there will always be, as Phil says, not a small bounty, but a hefty bounty of unintended consequences that are going to come along for the ride. And, so often the unintended consequences are vastly larger than the intended consequences. And sometimes none of the intended consequences at all happen, and we only get the unintended consequences. I mean, this is the stuff of tragedy that there, it is the ridiculously unfair position of life, that we are inherently ill prepared, but there's no practice. Go, the light's green, it's time to go. We have to act anyway. And this is just how it is. So I think about, one of my favorite things about the history of the tarot deck is whoever's idea it was to come up with it thought to make the very first card the Fool. Right? You want to begin any journey, you want to take any action, you want to do anything. Step one is to admit you have no idea what you're doing. I mean, this could be your area of expertise and you've been doing it for 39 years and nobody on earth knows this as well as you do, but you're still a fool because you're finite and the possible consequences are infinite. You're only going to have a tenuous grasp of control over the situation that you act on. I keep thinking about the recent studies, the retrospective failure analysis done in the journal Nature, where they went through all of the experiments for a long period of time. I can't remember how many decades they looked at, and discovered that fewer than 50% of the experiments could be reproduced. Just an enormous amount of bad science has been taking place in the modern world. And it's ironic because of all the places in the modern world where we're supposed to be the most open and direct about our fallibility, it's science. The whole failure and error is the entire engine of science. What makes science work is that we begin by saying, hey, we don't know everything. Our favorite ideas could be wrong, and the only way we're going to find out is put them to the test, and we're going to discover a certain number of our favorite ideas are going to fail these tests because reality is merciless when it comes to its appetite for grinding up our favorite ideas and theories. And it is interesting that the failure rate is so high in the one part of the modern world where we care the most and are the most meticulous about trying to keep track of error. And it just makes you think how much of what passes for politics or economics or anything else, where people are much sloppier about keeping track about whether the things that they said were true or not, how much of it is just complete garbage that our society is built on, is untested, unexamined. Let's not look again, let's move on, and if anything's wrong, let's be sure that we slide out of it and blame somebody else, that it's not our fault. I also think about the way that one of the primary engines for agency capture, the way that federal agencies, this is the broader term for regulatory capture, which is a subset, but the way that agencies that have a job to do and are supposed to be focused on that mission and the population that they're supposed to be serving, almost uniformly over the last 50 years have been captured by the Beltway. And much of the money that was supposed to originally go to providing direct services is now sort of channeled to the Beltway into the pockets of large corporations. And I was in the Department of Veterans Affairs when they broke out of their agency capture and retook over their own computer department from in-house, and they kicked out the contractors. And I worked there through the decades when the Beltway managed to do a bureaucratic coup d'etat and take it back and reestablish agency capture. So I lived through the whole thing. I wrote through the whole thing. I taught through the whole thing. And it's like one of the things in life I know the most about is what happened at the VA from 1975 to the present. And what's interesting is the extent to which the engine for converting managers into quislings, for getting them to sell out their constituents, is this very issue. Do you want to be blamed for the things that go wrong? Because with very large organizations, it's simply impossible to understand enough to be in charge. As a single point of management, you're supposed to be in charge of an entire nation full of hospitals and clinics, hundreds of thousands of employees, all the things that are happening. And if anything anywhere goes wrong, you're the one they're gonna stick on the bonfire. Nobody wants that position. Nobody wants that. It's too much. It's too scary. It's the certainty of failure and the punitive, what's the word for the kind of society where everybody sues everybody? Litigious nature of our society. Nobody wants to be in that position. So the way they're seduced into selling out to the Beltway is, if you outsource the work and the responsibility, then you outsource the risk for who gets blamed. That is, it's not my fault. I chose IBM. Everybody chooses IBM, right? I mean, IBM is the choice. Everybody agrees that it's safe to make. So even if IBM screws the pooch and your whole system fails and people die, it's not my fault. You can't sue me. I'm not to blame. IBM is to blame. The value of that in a highly centralized, highly hierarchical, highly litigious society cannot be overstated. It is the way all the top level managers in all of the government agencies end up selling out their agencies. That's how they do it. It's because this way I am managing the awful existential stress of being in charge of things I can't possibly succeed at, and I don't want to be blamed for when they go wrong. I outsource the risk. I contract out, and the contracting, the money, it's worth many billions of dollars. It's worth approaching trillions of dollars, basically, to the people who are put into those positions. And so the motivation to sell out the agency and to believe that while you're doing it, you're not actually selling out the agency and it's fine, everything's okay, this is in the best interest of everyone. It's really easy to see how the whole psychology works to lead to why it would be the case that it's not one or two agencies that eventually sell out, but all of them. They have to. It's not for Homo sapiens to be put under those levels of stress is just unacceptable in a society that is not willing to tolerate failure. I think too about, when we're talking about the journal Nature, the other thing that I think about this is that failure is, again, supposed to be the engine of science. Right? The purpose of science is to harness failure into success. You're supposed to run the experiment and document any outcome, success or failure. And you know that you're going to have more failures than successes. So you're supposed to document those. And by documenting them, you're gradually putting signs up on all of the dead ends so that other people don't have to follow those same mistakes that you made. And by process of elimination, you find the way forward. And then you can put a sign on that so other people can follow. The point is, if you're not failing a whole lot and documenting your failures, you're not doing science. You're doing some other thing, right? I mean, you want to get to the success. Of course we want to cure cancer. But if you're not documenting all the things that did not cure cancer, it isn't science, because you're going to find a lot of things that don't cure cancer on your path to trying to cure cancer. So when we look at what happens in the journal Nature and we say, how did all these people not document their failures? How did they mistake and or misrepresent their failures as successes? Why would this happen? How could people who more than any other part of the population are incentivized to do real science, how could they end up doing pseudoscience instead? What would make that happen? And of course, it's not hard to see if you look into the economics of science, which is most of these people are, 1 or 2 months away from not being able to make their rent and being homeless. We underpay academics, we underpay grad students, we underpay all the people who do this stuff, and they are desperate to produce results. The people who fund them, they don't want to hear about all the ways that you don't cure cancer. Even if that's science, they don't want it. They want to hear about the way that does cure cancer. And that's what they're going to reward you for it. If you can't produce that reward, then you can't make your rent and you become homeless. So again, intolerable, perverse incentives are systematically put in place so that even the people who are most concerned with human epistemology and how to harness it to find a path forward towards the truth, even they, over half the time, distort the process of science so badly that what they produce is pseudoscience instead of science. So when we talk about human epistemology and sort of the difficulties of the situation, we're talking about big stakes and a widespread problem. This is everywhere in our society today. And this is the stuff that the Greeks are talking about with Gnothi Seauton and what Kenneth's talking about in this paragraph. Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon, come off mute.
So I want to make sure I understood what you said, because I think what I'm hearing, you said in science, the failure rate was particularly high, and a lot of the experiments were not reproducible. there was lack of reproducibility. Did I get that right?
Yes, in the retrospective that was done on articles published in the journal Nature over the last, I can't remember if it was 10 years or 20 years or how far back.
Yeah, but all of that, I see it, the lack of reproducibility, the litigious culture, the lack of accountability, is part of the mythos and logos that we as a society have established. And this is what we want to be operational.
Yes. Yes.
Right. And scientific experiments have a failure rate, yes. And sometimes they're not reproducible, but that doesn't mean that they're not valid. I think that's just the nature of science, to fail and exhibit considerable variability.
Yes, I didn't make this distinction the way that I meant to. Failing to find a cure for cancer isn't a failure of science.
No.
That would count as a success. If you published a journal article that said, we tried this approach and it absolutely didn't work, that would be reproducible. So that would be good science. Somebody else could try that experiment. It would also fail. And they say, yeah, I can see that that's the case. What they're finding in this retrospective of articles in Nature isn't that sort of situation. It's the situation where people say, oh, I did find a cure for cancer. But when you try to reproduce it, it turns out they didn't. They had their thumb on the scale because they couldn't get funding for the next quarter unless they produced positive results. So they produced positive results, even though the only way to do it was to violate the science and put their thumb on it.
Well, that's the mythos. Not even the logos, the mythos, because science itself is a continuous cumulative process.
Right. And it depends upon people accurately reporting their failures and not trying to pretend that they're successes.
That's correct.
That's successful science involves a high percentage of well-documented failures, and we should be cheering people and funding them for producing that. But instead, we produce these funding models with perverse incentives where we say, well, your science better not have any failures in it, because if you publish any failures, well, then you're going to lose funding. This, puts people in an impossible situation, because if they do proper science, they're supposed to produce failures. They're being asked by their funders to do the impossible, which is to, discover the truth without ever along the way discovering any falsehoods. Discovering falsehoods and weeding them out is how science works.
Yeah, and that's just not science. That's a myth.
Right.
That's my point here. All those factors that you just outlined, it's part of the myth under which we operate.
Right. And well, this is where we run into the vocabulary problem, because the modern English word myth is the right word to use. It's, there's falsehoods here. But the ancient Greek word myth doesn't mean what the modern English word myth means. I mean, the ancient Greek word mythos would be the very thing that tells us, be careful about the perverse incentives you put in place where people will produce bad data just in order to satisfy you. The mythos can warn us about the problems with our logos systems of funding, economics, and so forth. But we can hardly say this in English because, this whole realm of the irrational, the soil of experience out of which truth grows, modernity has demonized it, and, that's all bad stuff, and we're not supposed to look at it. We're just supposed to follow the rules, and supposedly only good things will be the result.
So in drawing the comparison or the corollary between modernity and the Greeks, I think over the time period, the level of complexity has made this argument a little harder to delineate.
Yeah. The modern world is so complicated. Oh my God. None of us can keep track of it. I like to think about how, the core of the US legal system is that ignorance of the law is not a defense. If you commit a crime, you commit a crime. But the problem is the legal system is so complicated. Literally no human being alive can possibly know the entire legal system. Even someone who's been a lawyer their entire life, almost certainly specializes in some areas and is weak in other areas. And so even an expert can't obey the law with 100% certainty, which means, according to our legal system, it's their fault somehow when they break the law, even though they have worked harder than any other person could possibly work to try not to break any law anywhere. They tried to learn it all. They tried to understand it, figure out how it works. And so this creates in our judicial system a system of perverse incentives, right? In which people aren't know they're being asked to do the impossible. And since that's not possible, all they can really do is cheat in some fashion. They might try to cheat with, you know, good intentions, you know, to try to be a good person, or they might try to cheat with bad intentions, but nobody can satisfy the, you know, the what's been asked of them, which is to know 100% of the law and never get any of it wrong. You know, it's similar when we create these incredibly intricate economies and funding systems that say, well, you're not guaranteed to have a home ever. We might take it away from you at any moment if you can't pay your bills. So, you know, you might be just a month away from living on the street. But we want you to not be focused on that. We want you to go work on these other things over here and somehow pretend that you're not in existential jeopardy every day of your life. No, this is impossible for the human mind. You know, we're basically, moderns are all operating under these levels of stress from being pulled in multiple directions with different kinds of perverse incentives. You know, the simpler life of a peasant, it's not that life was easy as a Greek peasant by any means, but it certainly was a lot less complicated. For a modern, it's very hard to keep track of what the hell's going on. You know, we talk about, you know, in US politics, we demonize the large number of people who don't vote every election. And yet, if you look at the incentives on people, how many people are working 2 or 3 jobs to try to make ends meet, and many of those jobs won't give them any time off, including to vote. So they literally can't walk down to the booth. And in how many places are states being gerrymandered, and how many places are, you know, people being pushed off the rolls, and, you know, voter cleanup movements, and then, you know, the work that they have to do to try to get back on the roll, or even to discover they were pushed off the roll in the first place until it comes time to vote. There's enormous numbers of reasons why people can't actually vote when the time comes. But because it's so complicated, we don't really want to think about all that. It's too messy. So we just tell ourselves, well, they're just lazy. They just don't care. My wife and I are rewatching The West Wing, the TV series from the beginning. Aaron Sorkin wrote it and has some incredible dialogue and some great plots. And it comes up repeatedly, the scoffing at the people who don't vote. You know, and I'm like, well, I know in Mississippi and other places, there have been people purged off the voter rolls who never did anything wrong. And they may not find out that they've been purged until they actually go to vote. And yet, the way that we describe, we come up with, and this is where I think that your use, Sharon, of the modern word myth is appropriate. We try to come up with a simple story to explain it. And we say, well, they're just lazy. They just don't care. It must be that. Because the reality is far too complicated to think about. And it's far too upsetting to try to take into our heart and, you know, and respond to with, you know, to do justice to it. So
that again, I would say, is the operating mythos.
Yes.
Mythos to achieve the endpoint, the goal. Right. And this is the way in which I find, particularly the way our society, the dialogue that we're entertaining now, it's, mythical or mythos or not actual. It's very interesting. And so I go back and I look at the Greeks and I see that their society was not as complex as ours. And the top of their society, the aristocracy, seemed to have had more character or exhibited more character than what we're being exposed to now. And I know I'm at risk by saying that, and I'm trying to make my mind up about it, but that's my general impression.
Yeah, we might express that by saying that in their culture, character was considered necessary if you were to be in charge. And so whether they had good character or not, they knew they at least had to fake it, and they had to talk about it a lot. Whereas we don't, right? I mean, you look at the list of requirements for becoming president of the United States, and nowhere on the list is you should be a person of good character. It's like, you know, you have to be a citizen of the US of a certain age and you know, not committed a felony. And I think that's about it, right? I mean, it's a very short list. And you when you look at that, you think, well, up until he was caught, wouldn't Ted Bundy have passed that? I mean, haven't we designed a constitution in which Ted Bundy could be president? Is that good? Is this Is this the best of all forms of government? Is this the greatest constitution that ever existed? What you bring up, Sharon, is right on the money. That this is one of the difference between modernity and the ancient worldviews. Is we have formal systems, right? Very logos oriented formal systems with rules that tell us when we're allowed to do things, such as who's allowed to be president. And we trust in those systems so much that frequently we don't even look at them to see if they make sense. I think most Americans couldn't give a comprehensive list of the requirements to be president, to be eligible to be president of the United States. And it's not because they don't care, but it's because we've sort of learned to treat the formal system as a solution in and of itself. Whatever, it's too complicated to think about, so we'll put a system in there, and surely the system somehow, through garbage in, garbage out, the invisible hand, it'll work out the problem, and then I don't have to think about it. And this is sort of how we approach all these things, and this is why we get very surprised sometimes by who actually ends up being president. And we're like, how is that even possible? The answer is, well, our system doesn't work that good. We have enormous faith in the system because it's a system, rather than because it has actually satisfied our requirements for what we need out of the system. And this is why it's possible for so many federal agencies to be captured by the Beltway, and nobody notices, because they're still systems, they still exist. And the fact that the actual experiential details of whether they're serving the populations in question is too complicated to think about. So we just say, well, we've got a system for that. Everything must be fine. Let's not think about it. So there's a way in which modern society is certainly vastly more complicated than, say, Athenian society was. But our ability to understand that complexity is not necessarily any better today than it was 500 BCE. We too kind of use big sweeping generalizations and try to not think about all that extra complexity, because we sort of can't handle it. The number of things that a human brain can think about at the same time hasn't grown in the last 2,500 years, even though the complexity of the system has.
So can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
Because I think the next paragraph kind of says in Kenneth Smith speak what we're talking about.
It does.
Where it says, like prehensile organ, myth gathered into coherent handfuls the psychically colorful issues of human existence.
Yes.
It made it possible to think in terms of principles and concepts, to modulate one's way out of merely personal or phenomenal ways of experiencing.
Yes.
And that's the way we order our society. Instead of merely feeling, the mythic mind was prepared for seeing the order of its world and its own self, instead of being blindly vulnerable to psychic forces. The mythic mind discovered the logic of the psychic and the psychological, which is where I think we are. Am I wrong? Am I misunderstanding that?
No, you're right on the money. This is the issues at stake right here. Yeah, I particularly enjoy this sequence through this chapter right here. So thanks for bringing it up. I'll take us back to it after I call on Phil.
Oh, sorry if I went ahead. That's my nature.
No, I understand. It's good. I mean, it's all interconnected. There's a reason why you jump ahead. You see the connections coming. So that's great. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm going to try to tie in what we previously talked about responsibilities and the problem of I guess understanding. I never visited the Jefferson Memorial, but something just came to mind that elevated my appreciation of Thomas Jefferson's. By the way, this is not to deny he did other things wrong. In his memorial, there are two panels, apparently. I mean, there are other things. The front-facing panel is the famous, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal and, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights on which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. That, of course, is a very monumental statement, a very aspiring statement, very important. But the opposite wall, there's a statement of justice. He said, it's something of this sort that I haven't memorized, and so I have to look it up again. It's something about like, of all the things we've done, it seems to me that the injustice that we have never been able to cure will someday come back, and God will punish us for what we've been doing, and able to fix. And in that, he is sort of almost confessing to himself and to God that he has failed in the monumental task, which supposedly the other wall declare all men are created equal, right? And he's confessing his failures. I mean, he didn't gouge out his eyes, but he did confess that it was his responsibility to at least move that along. And maybe he did, but he didn't certainly move it along enough that he felt very troubled by that. And justice will finally take reign over our freedoms of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So I thought that that was a tremendous thing to say, these are the things that weigh on my soul, as well as the aspirational things. So the fact that he's able to say that, and I guess maybe not him, but somebody put it on the other side of the ledger, that, you have both sides, the good Thomas Jefferson and that not quite so good Thomas Jefferson. And he takes responsibility for that, even though obviously he didn't have the power to do what was necessary. But nonetheless, if he didn't have the power, who the hell did, So that's important to take that into account. I somewhat disagree with you that, about the thing about, trying to escape from the responsibilities. That's true. I think really it's the system and the structure itself that's doing most of the work. And when you were talking about that, the thing that immediately struck my mind was the educational system. We've gotten to the point we are teaching the answers to the tests. So they're learning the same old, rather than what the most fundamental thing about human beings is that we are capable of thinking. How deep we could think is questioned. It probably varies to a certain degree. But that's the most fundamental thing that makes us human, as we could think. And when they're in grade school, if you're not encouraging them to think and make mistakes, as you say, the mistakes are the most important thing, because then you understand the other side of the wall, as Thomas Jefferson understand. So they could eventually get to adapt to the way they think, rather than this is the way you should think, just follow the book and you'll get the answer. I think that is so welled into you. And you could say that's a surplus in a way, because if you have a society that's based on the market structure, you don't want people to think. You want them just to work. You want to dull their sense of thinking so they could think enough just to follow the rules and produce more goods, and that's it. We don't fucking care if they kill themselves doing it. And so I think that is blasphemy to the human condition, because You know, if we weren't able to think, we would not have survived, right? Because we're certainly not strong and we don't have whatever. We have a sense of community and we have a way of thinking. And that's why we, through our thinking, has been able to understand things better and better. So I think, yeah, it's a thing. And there's, I don't know, the conscious conspiracy, I think maybe it is, but the system structure it that, you know, you kind of have to dull people's senses for them to be able to sustain that drudgery of repeated work, you know. Now, maybe we're at the point we're going to break through that, you know, we automation is getting good enough. So you don't need all those workers, which by the way, is a different problem, right? Now you have to work out a different way of distribution. And so like with the present system, you don't think that. Now they don't even know how to think. They're just thrown on the streets. You know, as Stephen said to me, I hope I don't have to live under the bridge. And Stephen said, sorry, Phil, this bridge is taken. Thanks, Stephen. So I mean, like, I think that we have to correct the most fundamental thing is get people at least to want to think and explore and be creative in their thinking, you know? And to think about, why don't you add a piece of paper and extend the thing beyond the limits of the boundary of the frame of reference? I think it would be exciting if you had children who are able to do that, even if there was plenty of mistakes, you know. I think we also have to figure out a way to handle, let's say, like I said, to be compassionate about them, make mistakes and encourage them. No, because I know that when I make mistakes, that's when I actually learn more. You know, otherwise I'll just keep doing what I do until like, oh, what, that doesn't seem to work. I got to try something else. So, yeah. So it's the system. We've gotten too comfortable in doing the productive thing, and we are very, very productive in producing materials. But I think we're eliminating the humanity in that. So I'll leave it at that.
Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Thing that I have kind of thought about, you know, the Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And I forgot the middle now. It says the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There are those three things that stand out. Because I think, and again, it's part of the mythos. What is happiness? I think happiness is the pursuit of learning in an environment of ideas. And that, I think, equals curiosity. And I hear Phil talk about how the education system really is failing for the most part, the population. But I noticed that the Greeks, they recognize the different capacities in human beings. And I do not know if they structured their society to that. And you can tell me, Rick, but I think in our society, and especially now since we now have ChatGPT, we don't even have to think, we just have to plug it in, you know? But I think in our society, the one factor that I see, and I have younger grandnieces, you know, and grandnephews, the one thing that I see among them is just a total lack of curiosity. And it's curiosity that drives learning. And that's a life sustainer. And when I challenge them, it becomes like a bother. But again, the myth that they're being taught and the logos that's set up in their educational system is not setting them up to lead maybe a productive life, but certainly one that is going to be sustaining by engagement, by being engaged with it.
Yes.
Did I make sense?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. You made a lot of sense.
Yeah, in the 1980s, I read a book of psychology that described an experiment that was done with kittens, and one group of kittens were allowed to explore their environments freely, to walk around and do things, and the second group of kittens was just placed in a little basket, and the basket was carried around, and they could look at things, but they couldn't interact with them. And they found that the ones that actually engaged with the environment, were free to do so, were far more curious and engaged and intelligent. And the ones that had been forced into a passive position of just, going along with the larger forces around them, had much lower curiosity and much lower intelligence. And I think what you're describing is the human equivalent of that. When we were kids, there was a lot more free space. Kids were allowed to wander around more than they are now. They were allowed more unsupervised time than they are now. And they were allowed to get their hands dirty and engage with things and make mistakes more. The educational system was not as obsessive about detecting any deviation from the educational requirements and punishing kids for it. So, you could have two kids both graduate high school who had really different minds and saw the world in really different ways. But it's getting harder and harder to do that because of No Child Left Behind and other forms of standardized testing, where if they don't distort the entire curriculum just to focus on helping you pass the test, then the rest of your life is going to be screwed, because the outcome of the test is going to determine where you're allowed to go to college, what kind of jobs you're going to have, and so forth. So there's this unintended consequences way in which, right in the name, No Child Left Behind, it sounds like we're trying to make sure everyone's taken care of. But what we're instead doing is stamping out uniformity and passivity and punishing kids for, deviating from the line that we want them to toe. It cannot help but suppress the creative mind and the ability to think, because the kids that spend more time being creative and thinking are spending less time figuring out how to pass the test, so they get lower test scores. They don't know what's going to be on it. They aren't prepared for it. They might excel greatly in some other area, and it might be some area that our civilization desperately needs in order to survive, but we're still going to punish them, because this is what the modern order values. It values systematizing. A child is a child is a child. They're supposed to be interchangeable commodities of production that are being developed. And we need to make sure our corporations can swap them in and out. So if any of them, doesn't produce at the right level, or tries to form a union, or does some other kind of troublemaking thing, we can just throw it away and go pick up another one and slot it into place. This is the thingly orientation of the modern world. Everything is what it is, and it's not what it's not. We have definitions for each category, and nothing's allowed to, get outside of its silos or out of its frame, to use Phil's terminology from the earlier discussion. So all of these things have an impact. And it was in an earlier discussion a few months ago that we talked about the way that this is the exact opposite of the ancient Greek concept of paideia. And the ancient Greek concept of paideia is that the human soul or character is a mystery. Nobody knows in advance what anybody else is fully capable of. What we do know is that people have differential gifts, and whatever your gifts are, even if they're different from my gifts, those may be incredibly important gifts. And that the purpose of the educational system should be to let people play around and explore, so that everybody has a chance to find what those gifts are. And then the society should give each person the opportunity that they need to cultivate the gifts that they're better at than anybody else, so that those gifts become available to the culture as a whole. So that we don't have a bunch of mediocre people, but we have who are all pretty much the same. We have a whole bunch of very different people. One person might be an incredible poet. Another person is an amazing dancer. Someone else can make the worst soil bear fruit, and feed the people. That everyone's got different things that they're good at, and they're allowed to be weird. They're allowed to be, to focus on those things that they have. This is that term they have, arete. Your arete is the thing that you could be better at than anybody else. And the purpose of the educational system has to be to give people the chance to discover those aretes and to cultivate them. Yeah, paideia, Stephen's right, that link. Paideia was the term they had for this. And the general term they had for it was anthropoculture, the cultivation of human beings who are capable of producing the gifts required for a civilization, the varied gifts required for a civilization.
Hey, Rick, you're a damn socialist. I mean, it's going to cost a lot of money. How am I going to get my damn yacht if we do? If we go by your plans.
It's used for everything, isn't it? Because when I inspect socialist societies and the way their educational systems work, I don't see Greek paideia any more than I do in a market economy. What they share in common is this modern obsession with uniformity and systematization and measurements and rewards and punishments. Everything has to be, turned into a great machine. And if everybody could just not think or be creative and be the proper sized cog for where they expect to be placed in the machine, we could create a utopia. This is the modern obsession. With enough laws, with enough punishments, enough police, we'll just structure this whole society so that nobody, we don't risk anybody anywhere doing anything that isn't prescribed for them. They'll be like little computers carrying out their programs, and this is our recipe for a glorious new future. Sharon, and then Donald, and then I'll take us back to the text. Go ahead, Sharon.
So, forgive me for doing this, but this Kenneth Smith really encapsulates it here, right? In the next paragraph, halfway down, he says, Hegel saw all human life and cultural history as marked by teleological insurgency, the rise of consciousness from a state of merely implicit self-apprehension to explicit comprehension of self. As ineluctably as air rises in water, so human spirit struggles for light, air, clarity, freedom, for knowledge of its own inbound self. That's what we're talking about. Myth is the most pivotal step, vital step in a culture's learning to encompass the order that encompasses its feeling psyche. Through myth, humans digest the ineffable to gain a walking knowledge of their own dream life.
Yes.
And so one of the fascinating things, one of the things that really interests me as I read through this Mythos and Logos and compares it to the times gone, the early times, the times in between, and the times now, is how the fact that I think the establishment of Mythos and Logos is a continuing process.
Yes.
And that continuing process really impacts the character of the individuals and the character of society, and subsequently the way we live.
Yes. Yes.
That's what I'm taking away from this.
It's good.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought it up. There's a reason the paragraph ahead that you keep quoting from is the very next paragraph. This is where it's all leading to. He's really digging into these core issues, and part of what he's trying to explore is, as long as a modern you accept the premise of modernity, right? The premise of modernity is, as moderns, we're better than everybody else in the past. They're all worse. And the way you know it is by the name. Our name is modern. And the opposite of modern is primitive, savage, backward, superstitious, subjective, confused, inefficient, trivial. Modern means objective, scientific, educated, technological, gaining the power of the gods. Someday we'll fly through in starships through the stars. This idea of boundless access to the truth and to power that all comes from being educated, mathematized, logicized, systematized, that's the route for us to our utopia. It's built right into the word. It's why we call ourselves modern, specifically to praise ourselves and to insult the past, so that we won't ask questions like, is it true? Should we really, do we deserve to call ourselves objective? Do we deserve to say that we're smarter than anybody else has ever been? That we have a better grasp of reality than anybody else has ever had? Is that something that we ought to be claiming? And what, for example, does it do to the practice of science if, instead of starting where science says we should start, which is in our ignorance, our humility, our acknowledgement that the world is full of truths we don't yet have, if instead of that we start with the modern premise, which is that nobody's ever been better than us, that we're the most objective and the most educated and the most scientific, how would that distort the practice of science? So you can see how, even though modernity flies the flag of science and says part of why we're great is because of science, the very nature of its self-definition prevents the pure practice of science from taking place very often, which is why more than half of the articles in the most prestigious scientific journal we have fail the test of science, that they're pseudoscience instead of science, because our allegiance to being modern is greater than our allegiance to the various excuses we have for why being modern is great. That includes being greater than our allegiance to science. Among the ways that you can see this is that in everyday ordinary life, hardly any moderns ever practice science. I mean, as we see from this retrospective on the journal Nature, even many scientists don't practice science. Only some of them get opportunities to. And most likely, scientists who do get chances to practice science only get to practice it sometimes. It all depends on what their funding is, what they're required to do, what they're allowed to do, how in danger they are of making this month's rent. All of these pressures on them combine so that there are times when they're allowed to practice genuine science, and there's other times when they have to practice what we might call scientism, which is a kind of pseudoscience that wears the clothing of science, so that the blessings of the aura, the miasma of yes, I am a scientist is allowed to infuse a pseudoscientific article that they get published in a journal, which they use for funding. That's the best of us. The rest of us hardly ever do science, unless we're lucky enough to have a career where it's demanded sometimes. So it's curious when you actually, if you don't take modernity for granted, if you don't just pledge allegiance to modernity, if you start scratching the veneer and asking questions about, well, how deep is our commitment to these things that we say are our supposed virtues that we hold to a unique degree compared to anybody who ever existed, you quickly discover that we actually don't exhibit those virtues very often. We talk about them all the time. We dress up in them all the time, but we don't actually use them very often. Political science. To what extent is politics a science? If we look around the United States or around the countries of the world, how much do we see people actually carrying out a wide variety of political experiments and documenting the results, success or failure, honestly for other people to learn from, versus how often do we see people lying about what they've accomplished so that they can get elected next time? I mean, the balance of science versus, bullshit, basically, it doesn't look good for modernity. You could see why maybe we protest too much, because you can't actually bear up to the examination. So these are some things, and it's part of what's so radical about this book is even to say, let's run the thought experiment of freeing ourselves from the modern perspective long enough to understand some other perspectives, kind of sounds like treason of some kind, or some kind of blasphemy, or maybe there's some kind of it sounds culty or pseudoscientific. We get all of these unclear emotional kind of repulsions against the idea that anybody should ever want for even a moment to free themselves from the modern perspective. That can't be good. I mean, what are you saying? You want us to move to a perspective of primitivism and savagery and superstition? I mean, what could the alternative to modernity be other than something bad? And the only reason you want to do that was for bad reasons. All of this is built into the emotional, ideological framework of our attachment to modernity to make it impossible for us to even ask the questions that this book wants us to ask. So it's part of why it's not a coincidence that it's a struggle to work our way through this text, because every single, like we've said before, every important loaded term for understanding ourselves or the world is redefined by each epoch so that it seems to make the core premises of that epoch be unquestionable and obvious. And it's the same for modernity as much as it is for any other epoch. You can't even say free will or myth or fact without a whole bunch of unconscious value judgments that seem to reinforce why we really shouldn't be asking questions of modernity, why we should just accept it and go along with it. Because to do anything else, well, we might be a boat rocker, we might be a troublemaker. That's not okay. You know what happens to people like that, right? They end up homeless, or in prison or in mental institutions or dead. And we don't want that to happen to us. So really, let's just stop questioning the things that shouldn't be questioned. Donald, and then we'll go back to the text. Go ahead, Donald.
Took me a while to find that microphone button. I'd like to, I guess, kind of agree and disagree with you on education. I mean, it's certainly important. And I put my own children through a charter school here in Arizona. And one of the things was we had at the time, I don't know if Arizona still does, a statewide test that everybody had to take in order to get a high school diploma. It wasn't quite the Regents test of New York, but it was our version. But I think some of what you talk about is just a failure of confidence or will by educators, that when they resort to teaching the test, the school that my kids went to never taught the test. They had what they believed was the proper way to educate people. It may have been kind of an early Enlightenment, medieval, there are the 7 subjects and everybody studies them. So anyway, but they never had a student in the time that I was closely associated with school that failed to pass the high school graduation state exam by the 10th grade. Their view was their methods worked. Screw what the state establishment did. They would teach kids their way, and these kids would pass the test. The other thing was they had a different view about how to find those unique talents that children have and do that. And one of the ways is that they didn't have options in their curriculum. Everybody took science, everybody took math, everybody took Latin or Greek, everybody took then either French or German, everybody took history. It was kind of a great books influence type, You started off day one with the Epic of Gilgamesh and you finished up sometime with Marx or something in the 19th century. But the effect this had, I think, was children experience things that they wouldn't otherwise have experienced and discovered talents that they didn't know they had. Because, I'm not good at math. Well, maybe they really are. They just haven't had math. Maybe they don't like classical languages, but, they really like basketball. Well, they already know they really like basketball or something like that. But what they don't find out is sometimes that they also have a love of history or physics or biology because they were never exposed. And so this latent, this potential within them never got awoken. So yes, kids can explore, but one of the ways to help kids explore is to, in a sense, force them to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do, go against their natural inclinations, so that when they do finally say, well, this is what I really like doing, and I'm really good at it, they have experienced enough that it's more than just the first thing they ever liked doing.
Right.
So that's about that's about that. The one other thing, another topic maybe is, we talk a lot about Oedipus and how he's so smart, and being smart is his undoing. But we also have Odysseus, who's pretty smart. And, he has a lot of fun with some really pretty ladies on a very slow trip home from the from the wars there and he gets rid of all the suitors. He rediscovers Penelope. He raises his son. He's restored as king of Ithaca and has, lives great old time. I mean, it's not always being rational. Following the logos totally screws you up, even for the Greeks, So I just thought I kind of like that.
Yes.
And I know how Sharon, this is for you. I'm going to read some text. No, I'm not going to read text. I'm going to go to the second half of the paragraph that we've been working on. And one, Kenneth, I don't know what Kenneth is thinking sometimes. He says about the myth. Myth does allow us to get those sort of properties of a system as a whole that can't easily be, or if even maybe cannot be, derived from within the system. I like that. But then when he says autarkia or self-command, you see, I always, that grates on me a little bit, because that sort of autarkia with a K, its Greek root is self-sufficiency. And autarkia with a CH is self-rule. And I've tried, I kind of think that Kenneth is playing with me there, not me personally, but.
No, it's you personally.
Yeah, it might well be. Should feel picked on. that can you have self-rule without self-sufficiency? Those two things are quite close.
Yeah.
Together, if you're economically dependent on others, can you be your own man or your own person? Sorry, Sharon. There's not the person that, pays the piper gets the call to tune. And I think there's something there. There's a big topic there.
Yes.
And then his reference to, maybe you could take this up about Aesop's fables taught the logic of character or perspectival bias. They clearly do. But what bias does Aesop have? Aesop's a slave. He has a dualic perspective.
Yes.
If you're a slave reading Aesop, well, maybe you get some enlightenment. If you're Banausic or Aristic and you read Aesop, you think, oh, gee, I didn't know those doulos thought that way. I mean, I'm not sure. There's different myths, different layers within myths and within people, and at some point I'll stick with this thing until we finally take up Kenneth Smith's characterological study. But I might be in my 80s by then. But then this would make a little more sense in terms of the character types and the kind of literature they might produce. And Aesop, what is Aesop's fables get a kind of generality, but they also have themselves a perspectival thing of seeing people, or seeing the people, there are no people, the animals in them or whatever, the insects, you know, differently, metaphorically, like that. And that's something. So I think I kind of wonder what he means here, which is the Aesop's fables. They teach us something, yes. Are they teaching us Aesop's limitations and therefore helping us see our own? Or are we supposed to say, oh, Aesop's fables contain some sort of non-perspectival, you know, and sometimes Kenneth uses the word aperspectival, which I used to think, what does that word mean? But it means non-perspective. I think it's like atemporal, outside of time, a non-perspective bias. I don't think Aesop got there. So where did I'll at this point, I'm gonna, having said, what does this mean, Rick? Explain it to me. Thank you.
Okay, Donald, I will. When I said that he probably was doing it to bedevil you personally, for those people who haven't picked up any of Kenneth Smith's books, you've missed out on the fact that in Otherwise and Webs, otherwise I think more than Webs, he'll often at the end of his little parables, he'll say this is for so and so. His parables were often directed specifically, Kenneth Smith's parables were often directed specifically at students he'd had. And as I recall, Donald, one of them is directed at you. So I know when he's writing, among the people he's aware of as part of his audience is you, for sure. There it is. You got to come off mute because we can't hear you talking. He says, oh crap, I forgot I was on mute.
Yeah, it says, this is an email I got from Kenneth. He says, this is for Don, really, who after all these decades, 35 years, that was quite a long time ago, still puts up a fine and subtle argument in Plato's behalf, even if I have hammered and honed my criticisms of Plato to a fairly well.
Yes, I remember that email.
Yeah, regardless of the seductiveness of Saint Socrates, I had to wean myself gradually from Plato's rhetoric. So there I am. I'm an unweaned worshiper of Saint Socrates in the Platonic canon there. So anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've been hammered. He's good natured. Kenneth is not vicious about it.
No, he's good natured about it.
Good natured. You always feel that enlightened, I would say. Or yeah. So anyway, yeah. I keep this here on my desk to read anytime I think I know something about philosophy.
Yeah.
Just to remind me that I ran astray. But I do wonder. I mean, I've heard Kenneth on both sides, or at least two sides of Aesop and of Greek myth.
Yeah.
And it itself helps remove our perspectivism. But it itself contains its own perspectivism.
That's right.
And you have to work it both ways.
Yeah.
To get
all the meat out of it.
To free your own thought.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's typical of Nietzsche's writing, who Kenneth admired, and of Hegel, especially of Heraclitus's writing. And Kenneth has said it was a deliberate goal of his to try to cultivate that quality that they had in their writing, which is where when you write a sentence, you use paradox and parable and paradigm and other tricks like that to condense extra meanings into the same sentence. He's doing it on purpose. We know he's doing it on purpose. We've caught him doing it in other places. And I assure you, autarkia right here, for sure, he's aware of the pun that results from the pronunciation of the word autarkia, which is actually two different words. Like you said, the CH word and the K word. And, what is the relationship between self-command and self-sufficiency? Well, of course, the Greeks thought nobody is allowed to vote. No one is allowed to be a citizen in Athens who doesn't already have their own estate where they're producing the clothing and the food that they need. So they have to be self-sufficient before they're allowed to command anyone. And the theory is that if you go through the level of maturation required of a doulos to be able to produce the necessities of life, and then to go through the process of a banausos of learning, not to lose your mind in the marketplace and keep control over yourself, then you might just be ready to work your way up to the level of an Aristos and start prescribing for other people. But if you haven't done those things, you definitely aren't ready to start trying to command anybody else. And so they put this structure in place on purpose. So, where did I learn that? I learned that from him and the philosophers he pointed me to. So I know he's aware of it. So I would make this pun. I'm sure he's making this pun. And he may even be making this pun thinking about you, Donald, and snickering to himself going, oh, Donald's going to hate this.
He had me proofread some things at one time, and he used to always render analysis as to break down. And it used to, or to break apart. And it used to just drive me crazy because the Greek clearly means Anna is up. Yes. It's not down. It's not apart. It's not to, and I would say, no, can't you say, no. I said, can't you change that, whatever? And he would always do that. I think he was constantly just pointing out to me a rigidity I had, in the Greek, of course. Yeah. But Anna, it's up. Yeah. Analysis to loosen up.
It's gonna bug you until the day you die.
Huh?
Kenneth is great this way.
That's what my Greek teacher told me. And all right, enough. Go on to Stephen or.
Yeah, I'll go to Stephen and Sharon. But I want to point out that that kind of writing things that require an amphibious perspective to interpret, is definitely an explicit goal of his. So it's going to be the same with the Aesop reference here, because as you say, in some places he talks about Aesop as making the logic of character more accessible even to a doulos, certainly more accessible than any dry intellectual tract about human personality would ever be for a doulos. And so this is part of the anthropoculture project of trying to spread wisdom as far as you can to get everybody, even the densest people, to clue in that they should be skeptical about, the relationship between human character and human behavior. It's exemplified through all these animals. But he's also in other places talked about Aesop himself having the dualic perspective, being a slave, and that as a result, there are going to be limits to his understanding. I remember he talks about this when he talks about Diogenes Laertius, Lives of the Eminent Philosophers. And, he starts giving you these cool stories about these philosophers' lives. And people are like, oh, well, that must have really happened. He's like, oh, no, Diogenes Laertius has his own perspectives, and he's capturing the literature of resentment, where all these people, are like, those stupid philosophers think they're better than us. Oh, yeah, well, he had a stupid death. Oh, he thought everything flowed, so he died from, things not flowing. And this guy, to use their philosophies against them to create an ironic death, what are the odds that every single Greek philosopher died an ironic death? They're zero. Right? I mean, this is obviously it's fiction. It's the literature of resentment. But all over the internet, you can still find, educated academics quoting Diogenes Laertius as a source for these people's lives and presenting their ironic deaths as though they actually happened. And they're not able to read to the character of the author and think, what kind of guy would write this? And so, what should we trust and not trust about the way that he writes? So certainly when Kenneth's talking about this stuff, he's talking about perspective and bias. Of course, he both means, yeah, Aesop's trying to educate the douloi about character and bias, but also Aesop's got his own character with his own bias, and we should read him with a grain of salt. This is the natural way of writing. I find Kenneth's pretty good at it. Anytime he's got something he was able to compose and take time at, it almost always has these kind of dense layers to it. Some of the emails he does that with. Some of his email essays are equally well done. You can tell he took a day, to really work the text. But a lot of the time, his emails are not at this level. They're more dashed off, kind of half-baked thoughts, and those are the places where it's easier to catch him not doing this sort of thing you're asking about. You and I've read plenty of his emails where he just reads some outrageous thing that happened in the news, and he's like, I'm not going to take all day responding to this. This is just stupid. And he writes more like the rest of us do at that moment. It's just a very direct, simple response. But in something like this, he had the Comics Journal came out monthly. He had all month to write each of these essays, and sometimes he missed the deadlines, so sometimes it took more than a month. And they aren't that long. Each of the chapters is like, on average, 3 or 4 pages. And he spent the whole month doing it, that's how he gets the density of meaning in there. Is he edits and re-edits and re-edits and re-edits and says, ooh, I'm going to replace the CH with K in autarkia, and see if Donald complains. He's thinking, he's putting his little jokes in, he's putting his people in, he's putting his perspectives in. That this is how it ends up this way. So, Stephen and then Sharon. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, since Oedipus has been brought up, I'll just say, I do claim that back in the year 422 AD, I was in Constantinople, a barbarian being trained as a Roman soldier. I was learning Latin from, they had classes. You're being trained as a Roman soldier, you had to know Latin, so they actually had to teach you. And I was hanging around with some Greeks, so I had to learn Greek as well. The Romans were saying, well, why are you hanging around with Greeks? But anyway, they're going to have the Oedipus play, and out comes a guy dressed like Tiresias. Actually, Rick, you could make a good Tiresias if you grew your beard a bit longer. And he goes, this is what he says. He says, this is like the story of the Greek prince who had 2 bright eyes and yet was no better than a blind man in relation to what he hadn't seen. This is a problem. You look at the American mentality. We're going to make in warfare, we're going to make the absolute best weapons anybody's ever created. Look at the Russians, they make nonsense. But this is the trouble. You actually have to be able to use the weapons. A gun which is not fired, which can't be fired, which can't make it to the spot and be used in an expendable manner, is not a good weapon. It's like the Russians equip their troops with RPG-7s. The ammunition of an RPG-7, it's about a $500 shot. Americans use javelins, which the lowest price is $80,000. In other words, the Russians can go and shoot their weapons, whereas, well, the Pentagon, you'll have to get a special permission from the Pentagon to fire a javelin. This is a guy warned about this in the new Maginot line. He said that there's all these high-tech smart weapons you're building. You're going to run into trouble. He wrote this 40 years ago. And then right now, they're trying to build, 155 plain dumb ammunition rounds are what are winning the war, if you've got enough of them. But anyway, that's one issue. Now, this thing that Westerners have got, and I include you Americans, you're not going to get out of the door. Every department, every white-collar department on top of the rest of the society says, well, we're not just getting enough money. I know some university graduates that we would just love to employ. Great. I love you guys, how you think about money. But what happened in Niger recently in Africa? The French were getting a good part of their yellow cake from Niger for their huge nuclear industry. And how were they getting it? They had French troops in Niger pointing guns at people's heads. I just love how Westerners always talk about the free market. Oh, we can just go and buy our stuff. Except in Niger, they have to point guns at people's heads to get it. I mean, when you Westerners say, oh, I could employ this university graduate, get on the phone, get over to the troops in Niger, I think you're just going to have to beat up the local population to extract a bit more out of them. And of course, what's happened? Right behind your back, some Russian troops came in and kicked the French out. And everyone, the whole West is going, oh, what's going on here? You need to really pay attention to these sorts of things. That you Westerners keep on complaining, oh, if I only had a bit more money, I could employ this guy. What's going on in Niger? I don't imagine people living in Niger are doing as well as even the poorest Westerner. Yet at the same time, you Westerners are quite happy to get on the blower, dial up your troops in Niger, slap them about a bit more and give us some more stuff, is how your economy is running. A third thing I'd just like to say is the mystical document by John of Patmos, the Book of Revelation, the Apocalypse, which DLJ has reliably informed me is a load of nonsense. You still there, DLJ? And I would have thought so. But after learning a few things over many years, I'm starting to wonder, are we simply blind to what's in that book? Do we need a special set of glasses to understand what John of Patmos was trying to say? Thank you. Well, those are my 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, this goes back to that issue about the modern society being so complicated. It's like, in a complicated society like this, if you want to maintain a myth that you're the goodest people that ever lived and you believe in all the free rights and you would never hurt a fly, but you also want to be the wealthiest country in the world, which might require mistreating some people. The solution is the same one that every con artist at a carny uses, which is, you shuffle the cards and move the cups around, and there's a little bit of misdirection the magician does. And look at my hand over here while I pick your pocket over there. There's a level at which the complexity is used specifically in order to enable con games. And this is how we keep discovering things like, the US S&L crisis after the fact. Nobody notices it while it's happening. After the money has been picked out of everybody's pockets, then we all are shocked to discover that, everything was not 100% above board. And it's what I find is that that's the case with, if you follow the at least the US economy, if you follow it all the way down to the soil, You don't stop at the supermarket, but you keep going. So how did it get to the supermarket? How did it get to there? How did it get to there? How did it get to there? You eventually get back to the earth itself. That's almost always where you discover the injustices happening, because like you say, there's a level to which much of the modern economy is based on mistreating people, but doing it out of sight, so that everybody else can then, who knows nothing about it even happening, can then pretend that, well, we must be just a just society from top to bottom, because after all, I never saw anybody point any guns at anyone's head in Niger, so therefore it isn't happening. There's what we're aware of and what we're not aware of is used against us in order to structure modern society. It's in many ways, it's the reason why it's so complicated, because it's easier to do a con game if you actually move the cups and cards around than it is if you just leave them there and don't touch them. You have to get in there and muck about with it so that people lose track of things. Otherwise, there's no con at all. And it goes against the grain to argue that modernity is a heavily leveraged con game, because the word modern doesn't have conning built into it. It doesn't sound like a con game. Modern sounds like a good thing. How can it be a con game? But of course, what every con artist knows, and what the ones who are willing to confess will tell you, is that every con depends on a patsy, and every patsy becomes a mark because of their overconfidence. So the moment someone starts saying good news, well, that's what all the spam emails from Nigerian princes telling me all I have to do is deposit some money in a bank account say. It's good news, you can be rich. Good news, you can purchase the Brooklyn Bridge. Good news, Texas is for sale for only how much do you have in your pocket? that's by coincidence, that's the amount. Kenneth talks about this a lot. This issue of the way that flattery and self-flattery are cultivated specifically to create the necessary conditions for a con to take place. And Aesop's Fables includes that. I mean, there's a fable right in there. I mean, there's more than one in which one animal flatters another in order to secure an advantage. And it's weird to think that after 2,500 years, this is still pretty much the basic architecture of modern civilization. Is the use of flattery to create the necessary conditions for a con. Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
This one's for Donald, because I want to say, Donald, that there is a relationship between self-sufficiency and self-rule. I don't know which one comes first, but I think if you're self-sufficient, if you know how to rule yourself, know thyself, then you're self-sufficient. And if you're self-sufficient, then self-rule is easy. That's point number one. They're not two separate entities, and they don't follow each other. I think they interact with each other, right? And I think it becomes more and more potent as our character evolves, right? The other thing that I wanted to say is when I was a kid, I read a lot of Aesop's Fables, and the fun. It was dinner table conversation with my dad, because the fun was to interpret it. And what I saw was that there was a symbolic relationship between the vices and the virtues of the characters in the fables. And so when Kenneth Smith says here, and to my simple mind, he says, like Aesop's Fables, it taught the logic of character or perspectival bias, because it was so interpretive. And Aesop was a fabulist anyway. Right, so that's the way I interpreted that. So if I'm off base, please help me here.
No, that's exactly what Aesop wanted you to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right on. That's right on.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I mean, it's like what we're doing with this essay right now. This is the way Kenneth writes his text. He doesn't want you to just read it and believe it like a gospel. He wants you to take it apart and say, what is he talking about here? Why would he say this? What's this all about? It's the same way that Aesop wanted us to read his fables. It's like, are we really talking about a fox and a crow? I think maybe we're not talking about a fox and a crow here. This sure sounds a lot like Billy from down the streets and the way that he interacts with so-and-so. I wonder if there's some larger lesson here. So yeah, thanks, Sharon. Phil, go ahead, and then we'll go back to the text.
Yeah, I'm going to start with a 1960s cartoon. The husband and wife, they're both older, and they were in bed, and the wife is looking very, very anxious, like. So the husband turns to the wife and said, "What's the matter, dear? What's bothering you?" And she says, "Well, I'm worried about continental drift." Right. In other words, the ground that I always expected was stable is moving. There is no grounding, right? And so the problem with Western thought, probably starting with Plato, is to establish a kind of metaphysics that the forms are stable. There is a grounding that is stable. We just might have some trouble figuring it out. And of course, during the modern period, probably starting with science in a funny way, is that this whole metaphysics of providing a ground is all bullshit, because it's indulging in all sorts of fantasies that we have actually no real proof of, right? So let's try to form a ground by forming, instead of looking upwards at the cosmos, of providing, sort of some trickle down ideas of, let's say, how the complexity of the world is actually stable. Let's form a kind of a foundational philosophy that what is actually underground, the structures. I'll tell you this story as a bypass. When I was living in New York, I went over to Brooklyn. There's a very, very famous walk near the shores in the Brooklyn Heights. Just right on the shore. And you can get a magnificent view of Manhattan. They're just like wonderful. And I was there and I was looking at it, and there was this gentleman next to me. And he asked me, like, "What do you think?" It's a beautiful skyline. Just marvelous, right? And he nodded his head and kind of in agreement. So I thought, in order to be polite, I should, of course, in reverse, ask him, what does he see and feel? And he says, "What I like is the rocks." Of course, I was mystified. Was he meaning like this, the facing of the buildings? I mean, what was that? And so I was looking a little puzzled exactly what he meant. And so he explained. Do you see in downtown, there are all these tall buildings? Do you see in Midtown, there are all these tall buildings? Do you see that in Soho, all the way up to Gramercy, it's a lot of low buildings, right? He says it's because the foundation is that these buildings are built on rocks. They're solid. You don't have to drive the piles in very incredibly deep. The reason why Soho and the middle part is that it used to be a swamp. So the ground is soft. So he taught me a great lesson on foundationalism. Right? Okay. The problem is the wife is saying, yes, but continental drift changes all of that. I mean, I suppose she's not really worried about her life because it's not that unstable, but she's worried about that the whole idea of understanding the world is ever shifting. And I think that's where, in a funny way, Hegel comes in, is that it's a dynamic process. We are sailing on a groundless ground, our ideas are, because ever it's emerging and changing, right? So the thing to do is to find either a grounding of some sort or some way to, in a sense, deal with the ever-changing condition. And my thought is, in a sense, I went back to Heidegger, and Heidegger says something very, very mysterious and strange, but it's somewhat pleasing. He says, language is the house of our intellect, of our thinking. He didn't say language was thinking. He uses the house of thinking. Because within language, everything comes home. What is far becomes near. So that we can look afar and see that, oh, you know, it was right here all along. What's the problem, right? Now, I'm not sure whether, I suppose you could say that, you know, a kind of univocal language like mathematics or logic maybe is the manifestation of that. Or is it a kind of poetic language, a mythos, that actually brings what's far into near? Which one is it? Because the univocal language of mathematics seems like, oh yeah, we got the absolute grid that will bring it near. Whereas the poetic language is kind of a little bit foggy. But isn't that exactly what the groundless ground is about? Is that you're the Flying Dutchman sailing in the ocean. It's always dynamic. I suppose you could conceptually put a grid on it, know where your location is, but in fact, you're drifting. And so that becomes an interesting notion, is like, okay, is our house made so it could flow through the dynamic movements, and therefore we understand the changing ever much easier? Or do we just have to, like, you know, we're going to have to find port and then we'll figure out what the hell we are? I don't know. I mean, it's kind of tricky. So, because, like, okay, to what degree should, well, you certainly don't want the language to be so ambiguous, like it doesn't make any sense, but solid enough that it go along with the drift, and yet dynamic enough to understand that it's drifting, because we are all drifting in the capsule of time. And so I think that's interesting. Language is, now, I think we could have certain kind of dreams and things of that sort that are a kind of form, a kind of thinking, but language seems more like a conscious dealing with it. And so I think there's also that relationship of the collective unconscious, if you want to call it that way, or the soul, that has also gotten used to a certain kind of stability, I guess, based on a kind of eternal harmony, but it's also fluid enough to flow with the changing conditions.
Yeah.
So I'm still thinking through that, but that seems like a very interesting. I mean, I guess we have to figure out a way to allow things to drift, but when we need a certain acuteness, we get in the precise language. Say, oh no, we need real details at this moment, right? You know, Captain, you know, the Saxon says it's so and so, you know, whatever it is, that sort. So you can't just say, well, we'll just wait and things will change. You know, the trade winds will bring us wherever. You know, I think you kind of need both. The particulars, you need fine focus, and the non-particulars, a drifting focus that allows you to flow through in time. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, you know, this is that thing we get into when we get into, you know, mythos or you know, deep philosophy, is the level to which the ground we're walking on is in flux. You know, I love the idea of a woman waking up in the middle of the night saying, I couldn't sleep because I was troubled about continental drift. You know, the time frames on which continental drift operates are so far beyond a human lifespan, you know, but it's a very philosophical thing to do, to worry about things that, you know, may or may not be directly relevant at the moment, but they affect your conception of your place in the world and how you see things. And you know, you know, Africa doesn't need to split off from South America right now before my eyes for me to be troubled by the idea that the ground under my feet is in motion. You know, it's this thing that the mind does when it reaches out beyond itself to project an image of the world. It also includes an image of time and the passage of time and how the world was and how the world will be in the future. And thus, things that may or may not ever directly affect us tangibly, concretely in our life at the moment, they wouldn't necessarily affect us that way. They will definitely, if we've built a mental model that includes those things, because then we feel like we've been trampled upon by the evidence, you know, or the I mean, what do they say, right? You know, it was a beautiful theory until one ugly fact came along, right? There's this way in which our beautiful creations, we don't want to see them knocked down. We commit, you know, this is part of the good thing and the bad thing about, you know, living a life of the mind in which you build out your understanding of how things work, your mental models, is, well, now you've built them. They're yours. They have your family scent on them. They feel right to you. And the process of science demands that we plow them under over and over as the world gives us evidence that our beautiful ideas aren't right. But we kind of don't want to, because, you know, there are ideas. They're not just some beautiful ideas. There are beautiful ideas, and it makes them even more beautiful to us. We kind of don't want to give them up just because they're false. Maybe we can just rearrange the whole universe to make them true so that we don't have to surrender them. And the fact that this is a rational proposition to the human mind speaks volumes about the human condition. It's like, I have a better idea. I'll just edit an infinite number of things out of the cosmos in order to make the cosmos harmonize with my lovely idea.
Well, Rick, let me add a point that's important that I sort of forgot in telling the story. is like, I am not worried about my individual life, to tell you the truth. I think I'll survive, Well, I only have maybe in the outside range another 25 years. I made it this far, no problem. Not that no problem, I'm slowing down. But my thought is, this is a very important part. Like, I was in the Hegel meeting and we were talking about, the owl of Minerva takes flight at dusk. It's very interesting. In other words, it takes off when twilight is setting. And I used to remember this discussion, people were very anxious about dawn coming when the day comes and you could see clearly. And I said, no, you have to count the whole thing. The night is part of the day. And I gave an example of, like, when I was younger and I could still see well enough to at least see the road, and quite often I have to travel long distances, I actually used to love driving at night. What I love about driving at night was that the fog has set in and things were very mysterious, which means it left a lot to my imagination to fill in the gaps.
I love that too.
Okay. So, but that was not the essential part. The essential part is when day comes, I could begin to see the horizon. And the horizon of the light began to shine on the mystery that I was looking at. And suddenly, some of my fantasies, or what you call, creative imagination, is some is falsified, some is authenticated. And I think that ability to go from this mysterious thing of creativity and potentiality and cross over the horizon is exactly the relationship between production and criticism. As an artist, the productive means pulls on your imagination. After your imagination, not only the public and the critics, but you yourself could look at it and say, maybe that is saying something. Or maybe say, oh, that's bullshit. You know what I mean? In other words, they are two different means and you can't mix them up. The production part is the part of creativity that allows you to, in a sense, cross over the horizon to, in a sense, have a degree of anticipation to the future that's coming. And I think that's what, in many ways, the darkness of night allows that imagination to fulfill its potential in its relationship with reason and understanding. And I think that we somehow have downgraded that creative part.
Yes.
That's even in science, certainly in philosophy, and certainly in the arts. So I think that's where the mythos is, that the owl of Minerva takes flight at dusk.
Yes.
And that dusk is where the creative potential comes from. And you can't criticize the creative potential. You can only criticize the product that came from it. Okay.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I mean, you asked from time to time about Artemis and her value, and you're talking about it right now, right? I mean, Artemis and Apollo were not originally goddess and god of the moon and the sun. Those were titans, Selene and Helios, that were in charge of those celestial bodies. Apollo was the god of light and enlightenment, and Artemis of nature and the hunt. But by extension, Artemis is the goddess of the wilderness and of the vast unconscious. Where he's the god of noesis, or the logos, she's the goddess of gnosis, or the the unconscious, the irrational, that huge bounty of stuff that enlightenment can grow out of, and without which there could be no enlightenment. And so, because of this sense of illumination being associated with knowledge and darkness with obscurity and a lack of knowledge, it was natural that over time the mythology would drift, so that Apollo would pick up the day and Artemis would pick up the night. And yet they don't mean that she's the goddess of ignorance. So they give her the moon to illuminate gently and in a different light, in a more delicate way, the vast unconscious. That bounty of mystery, would be the realm of Artemis. And that would be the side of mythos, of gnosis, of that part of our mind that is acquiring understanding and knowledge with or without our permission. We're asleep at night, and the words we've learned are busy forming connections with each other while we're dreaming, with or without our permission. It's like there is this relationship between the active and the passive that's necessary. Without the soil, you don't get the tree. Even if you despise the soil, well, too bad. You get rid of all the soil, all the trees die. So it is with that bounty of dreams and memories and feelings and unexamined experiences, things that we think we've forgotten but are still sloshing around in there. They're doing 99% of the work of our mind, and that's what frees up that little bit of space for us to do the analytical, logical thing that Apollo is overseeing for us. So we'll pick this up again in 2 weeks. Next week is my wife's last chemo session. They're going great. After next week, she'll be done. So we'll be able to shift back to our regular weekly schedule week after next. And next week, I hope you all have a great time off, and we'll pick this up. We'll pick this up then. Thanks, everyone.
This was a great session. Thank you, Rick.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. You managed to slow us down again.
No,
It's always a challenge.
I think we're going great. Because he keeps discussing the paragraph ahead.
Yes. That's right.
Thank you for being pushy.
That's my nature. Sorry.
Much
I'm not
appreciated.
sorry. That's just how it is.
Well, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Good luck, Rick.